The humid air of New Orleans hung heavy over the French Quarter as dawn broke on Palm Sunday, 1858. The cobblestone streets, still damp from the previous night's rain, reflected the pale morning light filtering through the Spanish moss that draped the ancient oak trees. In the grand mansion on Royal Street, the Beauregard estate stood as a monument to the prosperity built on human suffering. Esther moved silently through the servants' quarters, her bare feet making no sound on the worn wooden floors. At 19, she carried herself with a dignity that her circumstances could not diminish, though the weight of bondage had carved deep lines of exhaustion around her dark eyes. Her hands, calloused from years of labor, trembled slightly as she prepared the morning meal for the Beauregard family. "Esther, where's my breakfast?" The voice of Master Charles Beauregard boomed from the dining room, sharp and demanding. He was a man who had built his fortune on the backs of enslaved people, trading human lives like commodities in the bustling slave markets of the city. His wealth had grown exponentially in recent years, making him one of the most influential traders in the South. "Coming, Master," Esther replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within her chest. She had learned long ago to mask her emotions, to present the facade of compliance that kept her alive in this house of horrors. The Beauregard children, Thomas, age 8, Margaret, 6, little James, 4, and baby Catherine, barely 2, sat around the mahogany table, their faces flushed with the innocence that their father's business had long since stripped from the adults in their household. They chatted excitedly about the Easter celebrations to come, unaware of the darkness that surrounded their privileged existence. As Esther served the steaming grits and fresh biscuits, she caught sight of Master Beauregard reading the morning paper. The headlines spoke of increasing tensions between North and South, of abolitionists gaining ground, of a nation teetering on the edge of conflict. But here, in this mansion built on suffering, life continued as if the world beyond these walls didn't exist. "The Hendersons are hosting a grand Easter celebration this year," Mrs. Beauregard announced, her voice carrying the affected accent of Southern aristocracy. "All the finest families will be there. We must ensure the children look their absolute best." Esther's jaw tightened as she listened to the casual conversation about social gatherings, while she and the other enslaved people in the household lived in constant fear and degradation. The irony of celebrating the resurrection of Christ while perpetuating such cruelty was not lost on her. Later that morning, as Esther tended to the garden behind the main house, she noticed young Thomas watching her from the second-floor window. There was something in his gaze that made her uncomfortable. A calculating coldness that seemed far too mature for his 8 years. He had been spending more time observing the enslaved workers lately, asking questions about their daily routines, their sleeping quarters, their fears. The garden where Esther worked had once been beautiful, but years of neglect had left it overgrown and wild. Ancient crepe myrtles twisted their branches toward the sky, while jasmine vines crawled over crumbling stone walls. The soil was rich and dark, fed by decades of Louisiana's humid climate and frequent rains. It was here, among the forgotten beauty, that Esther found her only moments of peace. As the day wore on, the oppressive heat grew more intense. The sounds of the city, horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestones, vendors calling out their wares, the distant music from the taverns created a constant backdrop to life in the quarter. But within the walls of the Beauregard estate, a different kind of tension was building. That evening, as Esther helped prepare the children for bed, she overheard a conversation between Master and Mrs. Beauregard that chilled her to the bone. They were discussing the sale of several enslaved families, including children who would be separated from their parents. The casual way they spoke about destroying families, about treating human beings as property to be bought and sold, ignited something deep within Esther's soul. "The market is particularly strong right now," Master Beauregard said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who profited from misery. "We could get top dollar for the younger ones. The plantation owners in Mississippi are paying premium prices. As Esther tucked little Catherine into her bed, the child's innocent smile and trusting eyes created a stark contrast to the evil that permeated this house. The baby reached up with tiny hands, grasping at Esther's face with the pure affection that only children possess. For a moment, Esther's heart softened, but then she remembered the countless children who had been torn from their mother's arms in this very house. The weight of her circumstances pressed down upon her as she retreated to her small room in the servants' quarters. The walls seemed to close in as she contemplated the endless cycle of suffering that defined her existence. Outside, the sounds of New Orleans continued, music, laughter, life. But for Esther, trapped in this mansion of horrors, each day brought only more pain and degradation. As she lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, Esther's mind began to turn toward thoughts she had never allowed herself to entertain before. The conversation she had overheard, the casual cruelty of her masters, the innocent faces of children who would grow up to perpetuate the same system of oppression. It all swirled together in her mind like a hurricane gathering strength. The clock in the main house chimed midnight, marking the beginning of Holy Monday. In the darkness of her room, Esther's hands clenched into fists as she made a decision that would change everything. The seeds of a terrible plan began to take root in her mind, nourished by years of suffering and watered by the tears of countless enslaved people who had endured the unendurable. Holy Monday dawned gray and overcast, with thick clouds rolling in from the Gulf of Mexico. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and the Spanish moss hung motionless in the still morning air. Esther rose before dawn, as she had every day for the past 5 years, but today felt different. There was a clarity in her mind that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that both terrified and empowered her. As she prepared breakfast for the Beauregard family, Esther's movements were more deliberate, her observations more acute. She watched Master Beauregard read his correspondence, noting how his face lit up when he received news of successful slave auctions. She observed Mrs. Beauregard's complete indifference to the suffering around her, the way she treated enslaved people as if they were furniture, useful but utterly without humanity. "Esther, take the children to the garden after breakfast," Mrs. Beauregard instructed without looking up from her embroidery. "They need fresh air, and I have ladies calling this afternoon to discuss the Easter charity drive." The irony of discussing charity while owning human beings was apparently lost on her entirely. The 4 Beauregard children finished their meal and followed Esther outside. The garden, with its overgrown paths and hidden corners, had become their favorite playground. Thomas, the eldest, had recently developed a fascination with digging, claiming he was searching for buried treasure. His younger siblings followed his lead, their small hands eagerly clawing at the rich, dark soil. "Esther, tell us a story," little Margaret demanded, settling herself on a stone bench beneath an ancient magnolia tree. Her blonde curls caught what little sunlight filtered through the clouds, and her blue eyes sparkled with the kind of innocence that would soon be corrupted by the world she was born into. Esther sat on the ground nearby, her dark skin a stark contrast to the children's pale complexions. As she began to weave a tale about brave princesses and magical kingdoms, her mind was elsewhere, calculating distances, noting the depth of the soil, observing the children's habits and preferences. "Why do you live in the small room, Esther?" 4-year-old James asked suddenly, his head tilted with genuine curiosity. "Why don't you have a big room like us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Esther felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever the children's innocence collided with the harsh reality of their situation. How could she explain to a 4-year-old that she was considered property, that his father owned her body and soul, that she had no rights, no freedom, no future beyond what her masters decided for her? "That's just the way things are, little one," she said softly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within her heart. "Thomas," who had been digging near the old garden wall, looked up with dirt-stained hands. "Papa says some people are born to serve and others are born to be served. He says it's God's will." The 8-year-old spoke with the casual certainty of someone repeating lessons learned at his father's knee. Esther's hands clenched involuntarily. The blasphemy of using God's name to justify such cruelty made her stomach turn. She had grown up hearing Bible stories from her grandmother, tales of Moses leading his people out of bondage, of justice and mercy and love. The God she knew would never sanction the horrors she witnessed daily in this house. As the morning progressed, Esther noticed that the children had developed a routine in the garden. They always played in the same areas, always returned to the same spots. Thomas had been digging a series of holes near the back wall, claiming he was creating a fort. The other children helped enthusiastically, their small hands moving surprising amounts of earth. "Look how deep we've made it," Margaret exclaimed, peering into one of the holes. It was indeed deeper than Esther had realized, nearly 3 feet down and wide enough for a child to sit in comfortably. The sight of the hole sent a chill through Esther's body. An idea, terrible and perfect, began to form in her mind. She pushed it away, horrified by her own thoughts, but it returned with increasing persistence. The children's innocent game had provided her with something she hadn't even known she was looking for. That afternoon, while the children napped and Mrs. Beauregard entertained her guests in the parlor, Esther found herself alone in the garden. She walked to the holes the children had been digging, measuring them with her eyes, calculating their depth and width. The soil here was soft and rich, easy to dig, but stable enough to hold its shape. The sound of laughter from the main house drew her attention. Through the windows, she could see Mrs. Beauregard and her friends sipping tea and discussing their charitable works, probably planning to donate old clothes to the deserving poor while ignoring the enslaved people suffering in their own homes. The hypocrisy was staggering. "Esther," Master Beauregard's voice cut through the afternoon air like a whip. She hurried inside to find him standing in his study, a letter in his hand and fury in his eyes. "The Henderson's boy has run off, disappeared in the night like a thief. I want you to keep a close eye on our property. Any suspicious behavior, any signs of unrest, you report to me immediately." "Yes, Master," Esther replied, though inwardly she felt a surge of hope. Somewhere out there, a young man had found the courage to claim his freedom. The thought gave her strength, even as it reminded her of her own trapped circumstances. As evening approached, Esther helped prepare dinner and tend to the children's needs. Baby Catherine had developed a slight fever, and Mrs. Beauregard fretted over her constantly, calling for the doctor and demanding that Esther remain close at hand. The irony was not lost on Esther. This woman who showed such concern for her own child's minor illness thought nothing of the enslaved children who died from neglect and abuse. That night, as the household settled into sleep, Esther lay awake, listening to the sounds of the city beyond the walls. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear singing, probably from one of the slave quarters where people gathered to find comfort in music and community. The melodies were mournful yet defiant, carrying messages of hope and resistance that the masters couldn't understand. The plan that had been forming in her mind all day crystallized into something concrete and terrifying. She thought about the holes in the garden, about the children's routines, about the upcoming Easter celebrations that would provide the perfect distraction. Most importantly, she thought about justice. Not the perverted version that allowed human beings to be bought and sold, but true justice that demanded payment for centuries of suffering. As the clock struck midnight, marking the beginning of Holy Tuesday, Esther made her final decision. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a mantle, heavy but somehow liberating. For the first time in her life, she would not be a victim. She would be an agent of her own destiny, no matter the cost. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall, drumming against the windows and washing the streets of New Orleans clean. But in the garden behind the Beauregard mansion, the earth remained soft and ready, waiting for what was to come. Holy Tuesday brought with it an oppressive humidity that seemed to press down on New Orleans like a suffocating blanket. The rain from the previous night had left the air thick and heavy, and the garden soil was perfect for digging, soft enough to work easily, but stable enough to hold its shape. Esther noticed these details with the calculating eye of someone whose plans had moved beyond mere thought into the realm of action. The Beauregard household was in a state of controlled chaos as preparations for Easter intensified. Mrs. Beauregard had invited several prominent families for a grand celebration, and every detail had to be perfect. The enslaved workers moved through the house like shadows, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and preparing elaborate meals, while their masters discussed the guest list and social hierarchy of New Orleans society. The children must look absolutely pristine, Mrs. Beauregard announced at breakfast, her voice carrying the sharp edge of anxiety that always accompanied her social events. Thomas, you'll wear your new blue suit. Margaret, the yellow dress with the lace collar. And for heaven's sake, keep them clean until Sunday. Esther served the morning meal with mechanical precision, her movements automatic after years of practice. But her mind was elsewhere, running through the details of what she had planned. The timing would have to be perfect. During the afternoon, when the adults were occupied with their preparations and the children were playing in the garden, Master Beauregard was in particularly high spirits, having received word that a shipment of enslaved people from Virginia would arrive the following week. He spoke openly about the profits he expected to make, calculating the value of human lives with the same casual interest he might show in discussing livestock. "The market is stronger than ever," he told his wife, cutting into his ham with obvious satisfaction. "Young males are bringing top dollar, and families with children are in high demand for the sugar plantations. We'll make enough to expand the operation significantly." Esther's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, but she kept her expression neutral. The casual way he discussed separating families, selling children away from their parents, treating human beings as commodities, it reinforced her conviction that what she planned was not just justified, but necessary. After breakfast, Esther took the children to the garden as had become their routine. The holes Thomas had been digging were deeper now, and he had convinced his siblings to help him create what he called an underground fort. The children worked with the enthusiasm that only the young possess, their small hands moving earth with surprising efficiency. "It's going to be the best fort ever," Thomas declared, his face flushed with excitement and streaked with dirt. "We can hide here and no one will ever find us." The irony of his words sent a chill through Esther's body. She watched as Margaret and James took turns sitting in the deepest hole, giggling as they pretended to be soldiers hiding from enemy forces. Even baby Catherine, who could barely walk, clapped her hands with delight at her siblings' game. "Esther, come see how deep we've made it," Margaret called out, her blonde curls bouncing as she climbed out of the hole. "It's like a real cave now." Esther approached slowly, her heart pounding as she looked into the excavation. It was indeed deep enough now, nearly 4 feet down and wide enough to accommodate a small child. The walls were smooth and stable, held in place by the root systems of nearby plants. It was perfect for what she had in mind, and the children had created it themselves, unknowingly digging their own graves. As the morning progressed, Esther found herself studying each child with new intensity. Thomas, with his calculating intelligence and casual cruelty already beginning to show. Margaret, sweet and innocent now, but destined to become another Mrs. Beauregard, treating enslaved people as property without a second thought. Little James, who would grow up to be another Master Beauregard, buying and selling human lives for profit. And baby Catherine, who would be raised to see nothing wrong with owning other human beings. The thought of what they would become, the suffering they would cause, the families they would destroy, the lives they would ruin, strengthened Esther's resolve. This was not about revenge against innocent children. This was about preventing future generations of suffering, about breaking a cycle that had continued for too long. That afternoon, while Mrs. Beauregard met with the caterers and Master Beauregard conducted business in his study, Esther prepared for what was to come. She gathered the supplies she would need: rope, cloth, a small shovel, hiding them in various locations around the garden. Her movements were careful and deliberate, each action planned and rehearsed in her mind. The children, exhausted from their morning of digging, had settled into their usual afternoon routine. Thomas was reading in the shade of the magnolia tree, while Margaret played with her dolls nearby. James had fallen asleep on a blanket, and baby Catherine was contentedly pulling up grass and examining it with the intense curiosity of a toddler. "Children," Esther called softly, her voice carrying a warmth that masked the ice in her heart. "I have a special game for you to play." Thomas looked up from his book, his eyes bright with interest. "What kind of game?" "It's called buried treasure," Esther explained, moving closer to the group. "You hide in your fort, and I'll bury something special for you to find. But you have to stay very still and very quiet, or the magic won't work." The children's faces lit up with excitement. They had always loved Esther's games, and the prospect of finding buried treasure was irresistible. Even baby Catherine seemed to sense the excitement, clapping her hands and babbling happily. "Can we start now?" Margaret asked, bouncing on her toes with anticipation. "Of course," Esther replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "But remember, you must stay completely still and quiet. No matter what happens, don't move or make a sound until I tell you the game is over." As the children eagerly climbed into their holes, chattering excitedly about what treasures they might find, Esther felt a moment of hesitation. These were children, innocent, trusting, unaware of the evil that surrounded them. But then she thought of all the other children, the enslaved children who had been torn from their families, sold like cattle, worked to death in the fields. She thought of the children yet to be born who would suffer under the system these four would perpetuate. The sound of laughter from the main house reminded her of the Easter party being planned, of the wealthy families who would gather to celebrate while human beings suffered in bondage. The hypocrisy, the casual cruelty, the complete lack of humanity, it all crystallized into a cold, hard determination. As the children settled into their hiding places, their excited whispers gradually fading into silence, Esther picked up the shovel she had hidden nearby. The weight of it in her hands felt like the weight of history itself, all the suffering, all the injustice, all the pain that had led to this moment. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Esther began to work, her movements methodical and precise. Each shovelful of earth was a prayer, a plea for justice, a demand for an end to the suffering. The children, true to their promise, remained silent and still, trusting in the woman who had cared for them, fed them, told them stories, and loved them, despite everything. As the holes slowly filled with earth, Esther felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in her life, she was in control. For the first time, she was the one making decisions about life and death. The power that had always belonged to her masters was now hers, and she wielded it with the cold precision of someone who had suffered too much and endured too long. The clock in the main house chimed 4 o'clock, its sound carrying across the garden like a funeral bell. In a few hours, the household would discover what had happened. There would be chaos, investigation, punishment. But for now, in this moment, there was only justice, terrible, necessary, and long overdue. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as Esther completed her grim work. The earth had been carefully smoothed and covered with fallen leaves and debris, making the disturbed soil nearly invisible to casual observation. The children's excited voices, which had filled the garden with laughter just hours before, were now silenced forever beneath the rich Louisiana soil. Esther stood motionless for several minutes, her hands still gripping the shovel, her body trembling with the magnitude of what she had done. The weight of her actions settled on her shoulders like a physical burden, but beneath the horror and guilt, she felt something else, a cold satisfaction that justice had finally been served. The sounds of the household continued around her as if nothing had changed. From the main house, she could hear Mrs. Beauregard directing the servants as they prepared for the Easter celebration. Master Beauregard's voice carried from his study as he conducted business with a potential buyer. The normal rhythms of life in the mansion continued, unaware that everything had fundamentally shifted. Esther carefully cleaned the shovel and returned it to its proper place in the garden shed. She washed her hands in the rain barrel, scrubbing away the dirt and evidence of her actions. When she looked at her reflection in the water, she saw a stranger, someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, someone who had taken the ultimate step in the fight against oppression. As she walked back toward the main house, Esther forced herself to think practically about what would come next. The children's absence would be noticed soon, probably when they failed to appear for their afternoon snack. There would be a search, questions, panic. She needed to be ready with answers that would deflect suspicion, at least initially. "Esther," Mrs. Beauregard's voice called from the kitchen. "Where are the children? It's time for their milk and cookies." "They were playing in the garden last I saw them, Ma'am," Esther replied, her voice steady and calm. "Perhaps they've wandered to the front courtyard or the stables." Mrs. Beauregard frowned, her maternal instincts beginning to stir with the first hints of concern. "Thomas knows better than to leave the garden without permission. Go find them immediately and bring them inside." Esther nodded and walked back toward the garden, her heart pounding, but her expression carefully neutral. She called out the children's names, her voice carrying the appropriate note of concern for a servant looking for her charges. "Thomas, Margaret, James, Catherine, where are you, children?" The silence that greeted her calls was absolute and final. The garden, which had been filled with laughter and play just hours before, now felt like a tomb. The ancient trees seemed to lean in closer, as if they were keeping the terrible secret buried beneath their roots. After several minutes of searching and calling, Esther returned to the house with empty hands and a carefully crafted expression of worry. "I can't find them anywhere, Ma'am. I've looked in all their usual places." Mrs. Beauregard's face went pale. "What do you mean you can't find them? Children don't just disappear. Search again, and this time look everywhere: the stables, the carriage house, the servants' quarters." The search that followed was frantic and thorough. Master Beauregard emerged from his study, his face dark with anger and growing concern. The household staff was mobilized, searching every corner of the property. Neighbors were alerted, and soon the entire block was involved in looking for the missing Beauregard children. As the hours passed and no trace of the children was found, panic began to set in. Mrs. Beauregard became hysterical, alternating between tears and accusations. Master Beauregard's anger grew more dangerous with each passing minute, his suspicions falling on the enslaved workers who had access to the children. "Someone knows something," he declared, his voice carrying the cold menace that Esther knew so well. "Children don't vanish into thin air. Someone in this household is responsible, and I will find out who." The interrogations began that evening. One by one, the enslaved workers were brought before Master Beauregard and questioned about the children's whereabouts. The sessions were brutal, involving threats, intimidation, and physical violence. But no one knew anything because there was nothing to know, except for Esther, who maintained her composure even as her fellow workers suffered under suspicion. When her turn came, Esther faced Master Beauregard with the same submissive demeanor she had perfected over years of bondage. She answered his questions with appropriate concern and confusion, expressing her own worry for the children's safety while providing no useful information. "You were the last person to see them," Master Beauregard said, his eyes boring into hers with laser-like intensity. "What exactly happened in that garden?" "They were playing their usual games, Master," Esther replied, her voice steady despite the danger she faced. "Digging in the dirt, pretending to be soldiers. I left them there when Mrs. Beauregard called me inside to help with the party preparations." "And you saw nothing unusual? No strangers in the area? No signs that someone might have taken them?" "Nothing, Master. They were happy and safe when I left them." Master Beauregard studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, but Esther had learned long ago to hide her true thoughts and feelings. Her expression remained perfectly neutral, giving away nothing of the terrible secret she carried. As the night wore on, the search expanded beyond the property. The local authorities were notified, though their response was somewhat perfunctory. Missing children from wealthy families were taken seriously, but the assumption was that they had simply wandered off and would return on their own. Kidnapping was rare in New Orleans, and there had been no ransom demands. Mrs. Beauregard refused to sleep, pacing the floors and demanding that the search continue through the night. Lanterns bobbed through the darkness as volunteers combed the streets and alleys of the French Quarter, calling out the children's names. The sound of their voices carried on the humid night air like the cries of lost souls. Esther remained in the main house, helping to coordinate the search efforts and providing comfort to Mrs. Beauregard when possible. It was a delicate balance, showing appropriate concern without appearing overly involved, maintaining her usual subservient demeanor while secretly reveling in the chaos she had created. As dawn approached on Holy Wednesday, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The children had been missing for nearly 18 hours with no trace, no clues, no explanation. The Easter celebration that had been planned with such care was forgotten in the face of this tragedy. Guests were notified that the party was cancelled, and the house that had been prepared for celebration became a center of grief and desperation. The irony was not lost on Esther. This was Holy Week, the time when Christians celebrated the death and resurrection of Christ. But in this house, built on the suffering of enslaved people, there would be no resurrection, no redemption, no happy ending. There would only be the justice that she had delivered with her own hands. As the sun rose over New Orleans, casting its light on a city that remained unaware of the terrible secret buried in the Beauregard garden, Esther allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The children who would have grown up to perpetuate the system of slavery were gone. The future generations of suffering they would have caused had been prevented. The cycle of oppression had been broken, at least in this small way. But she also knew that her own fate was sealed. Eventually, the truth would come out. Eventually, she would pay the ultimate price for what she had done. But for now, in this moment, she had achieved something that no enslaved person in her position had ever achieved before. She had taken control of her own destiny and struck a blow against the system that had oppressed her people for centuries. The weight of that knowledge was both terrifying and liberating, and as she prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her, Esther felt a strange sense of peace settle over her troubled soul. Holy Wednesday dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering over New Orleans like harbingers of the revelation to come. The Beauregard mansion, once a symbol of prosperity and power, had become a house of mourning and desperation. The search for the missing children had expanded throughout the city, but as the hours passed without any trace of Thomas, Margaret, James, or Catherine, hope began to fade into something darker and more desperate. Master Beauregard had not slept since the children's disappearance. His eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion and rage, and his usual composure had cracked to reveal the brutal man beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. He had questioned every enslaved person on the property multiple times, his interrogations becoming increasingly violent as his frustration grew. "Someone in this house knows what happened to my children," he declared to the assembled household staff, his voice carrying the promise of terrible retribution. "I will tear this place apart, board by board, if necessary. I will sell every last one of you to the worst plantations in Mississippi if I don't get answers." Mrs. Beauregard had collapsed into a state of near catatonia, attended by the family doctor who administered laudanum to calm her hysteria. She sat in the parlor like a broken doll, staring out the window at the garden where her children had last been seen, her mind unable to process the magnitude of her loss. The local authorities had finally taken the disappearance seriously, sending Detective Henri Rousseau to investigate. Rousseau was a methodical man with sharp eyes and an intuitive understanding of human nature. He had seen enough tragedy in his years with the New Orleans police to know that the most obvious explanations were often the correct ones. But he also understood that in a city built on secrets and lies, the truth was rarely simple. "I want to examine the garden again," Rousseau told Master Beauregard as they stood in the main hall. "Sometimes a fresh perspective reveals details that were missed in the initial search." Esther, who was polishing silver nearby, felt her blood turn to ice. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that a thorough investigation would eventually uncover what she had done. But she forced herself to remain calm, to continue her work as if the detective's words meant nothing to her. The examination of the garden was painstakingly thorough. Rousseau walked every inch of the property, noting the children's favorite play areas, the holes they had been digging, the soft earth that had been disturbed by recent rains. His trained eye picked up details that the frantic searchers had missed. Subtle changes in the soil, areas where the ground had been recently worked, patterns that didn't quite fit with natural settling. "These holes," Rousseau said, kneeling beside the excavations the children had made, "they're deeper than I would expect children to dig on their own. And this soil—" He picked up a handful of earth, examining its consistency and color. "It's been moved recently, very recently." Master Beauregard's face grew darker as he watched the detective work. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Rousseau replied carefully, "but I think we need to excavate this area more thoroughly. If the children fell into one of these holes and were somehow buried—" The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Master Beauregard's face went white as the implications sank in. You think they're buried here, in my own garden?" "It's a possibility we need to investigate," Rousseau said gently. "I'll need to bring in some men with shovels. We'll be very careful, very respectful, but we need to know for certain." As word spread through the household that the garden would be excavated, Esther felt the walls closing in around her. She continued her duties with mechanical precision, but her mind was racing, calculating how much time she had before the truth was revealed. There was no escape now, no way to avoid the consequences of what she had done. The excavation began that afternoon. A team of workers, supervised by Detective Rousseau, carefully began digging in the areas where the soil had been disturbed. The work was slow and methodical, each shovelful of earth examined for any sign of the missing children. Esther watched from the kitchen window, her hands gripping the windowsill so tightly that her knuckles went white. She could see Master Beauregard pacing nearby, his agitation growing with each passing minute. Mrs. Beauregard had been sedated and taken to her room, unable to bear the sight of her garden being torn apart. As the afternoon wore on, the diggers worked deeper into the soft Louisiana soil. The holes the children had made were expanded and deepened, revealing the careful work that had gone into concealing what lay beneath. And then, just as the sun began to set on Holy Wednesday, one of the workers called out, "Detective! Over here!" Rousseau rushed to the spot where the worker was pointing. There, barely visible in the dark earth, was a small hand, pale, delicate, unmistakably that of a child. The detective's face went grim as he carefully brushed away more soil, revealing the peaceful face of little Catherine, her blonde curls still visible despite the dirt that covered her. The discovery sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Master Beauregard let out a roar of anguish and rage that could be heard throughout the quarter. The workers continued digging with renewed urgency, and soon the bodies of all 4 children were uncovered, arranged in their underground hiding places like sleeping angels. The sight was both heartbreaking and horrifying. The children appeared peaceful, as if they had simply fallen asleep in their garden fort, but the reality of what had happened, that they had been buried alive, suffocated in the earth they had helped to dig, was almost too terrible to comprehend. "How?" Master Beauregard whispered, his voice broken with grief and rage. "How could this happen? Who could do such a thing?" Detective Rousseau examined the scene carefully, noting the way the bodies were positioned, the evidence of deliberate burial, the careful concealment of the crime. This was not an accident or a tragic mishap. This was murder, planned and executed with cold precision. "This was intentional," he said quietly. "Someone buried these children alive. Someone who knew their routines, who had access to them, who could get close enough to..." He paused, the full horror of the crime sinking in. "We're looking for someone in this household, someone the children trusted." The investigation that followed was swift and brutal. Every member of the household was questioned again, this time as potential suspects in a quadruple murder. The enslaved workers, already under suspicion, faced interrogation that bordered on torture. But it was Esther's calm demeanor in the face of such horror that finally drew Rousseau's attention. "You don't seem surprised," he observed, studying her face as she stood in the parlor where the questioning was taking place. "Everyone else is shocked, horrified, but you seem almost resigned." Esther met his gaze steadily, knowing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. "I've seen enough horror in my life, sir. Nothing surprises me anymore." "But this is different," Rousseau pressed. "These were children you cared for, children you saw every day. Their deaths should affect you more than this." For a long moment, Esther said nothing. Then, slowly, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with a dignity that her circumstances had never been able to destroy. "You want to know who killed those children? I did. I buried them alive in that garden, and I'm not sorry for it." The confession sent shockwaves through the room. Master Beauregard lunged toward her with murderous intent, but Detective Rousseau held him back. "Why?" the detective asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do such a thing?" Esther's eyes blazed with a fire that had been banked for too long. "Because they would have grown up to be just like their parents, because they would have bought and sold human beings like cattle, because they would have perpetuated a system that treats people like me as property. I killed them to prevent the suffering they would have caused." The room erupted in chaos. Master Beauregard screamed for immediate vengeance, demanding that Esther be hanged on the spot. But Detective Rousseau maintained order, ensuring that justice would follow proper legal channels, even for an enslaved woman who had committed such a heinous crime. As Esther was led away in chains, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She had known from the beginning that this moment would come, that she would pay the ultimate price for what she had done. But she had also achieved something that no amount of punishment could take away. She had struck a blow against the system that had oppressed her people for centuries. The trial that followed was swift and predetermined. An enslaved woman who had murdered 4 white children could expect no mercy from a Southern court. But Esther's confession and her unflinching explanation of her motives sent ripples through New Orleans society that would be felt for years to come. On Easter Sunday, as churches throughout the city celebrated the resurrection of Christ, Esther was executed in the public square. But her story lived on, whispered in slave quarters and hidden in the memories of those who understood that sometimes, when all other options are exhausted, justice must be taken by one's own hands. The Beauregard mansion was eventually sold and torn down, but the garden where the children died was never disturbed again. Local legend says that on quiet nights you can still hear the sound of children playing, their laughter echoing through the darkness like a reminder of the terrible price of oppression and the lengths to which the human spirit will go in its quest for freedom and justice. In the end, Esther's story became a testament to the power of the oppressed to fight back, even when the cost is everything they have. Her name was forgotten by history, buried like the children she killed, but her legacy lived on in the hearts of those who understood that sometimes the only way to break the chains of bondage is to forge them into weapons